Welcome back, friends, to the Marc Claire Show. It's another Monday, and I'm back here in the saddle with another great conversation today with my boy, Jose Gallison of No Way Jose, fellow Florida man. Always good to talk to a fellow Florida man. And before we do that, I got to tell you about our fantastic sponsor, Mr. Fox, the fantastic Mr. Fox of Fox & Sons Coffee. How did I never say that before now? He's a fantastic guy, so it makes a lot of sense. Fantastic guy, fantastic company, fantastic beans. Steven actually started this company, well, to relive some memories he had with his father growing up drinking coffee, but also to teach his sons about entrepreneurship. Fantastic package, and I'm so happy to support his company, and he is equally happy, I suppose, after all these months, he's got to be, to support this show as well. So I want you to head over to foxandsons.com, foxnsons.com, grab yourself a bag of something. You can get a big bag. You can get a small bag. I recommend a big bag, but if you just want to sample a few different beans, feel free to do that, and I'm going to give you an 18% discount. 18%. I sat in the boardroom and negotiated this one for you guys, all right? 18% off any order over $25 by using discount code MCS. Once you've done that, once you've given it a shot, you're going to want to go back and get yourself a subscription. You get a 2-pound bag like this puppy right here for those of you watching on the video, which you can find on YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin. I think that covers about everything. Rumble, there you go. Should be in all those places. See how I interweave the promos? It's because I'm a master, my friends. But Steven Fox is a master at getting these beans to your house just like that, like clockwork every single month when you grab one of the subscriptions. And right now he's giving $4 off, which is, it's already a crazy deal. Trust me. Now you're getting $4 off. So head over to foxandsons.com, support a fantastic sponsor of the show. Again, the fantastic Mr. Fox. You got to support him now. It is time for my discussion with Jose Gallison. Welcome back to the Marc Claire Show. With me today, he's one of the scoundrels over there at the Tower Gang podcast, as well as the host of his own show, No Way Jose. Very pleased to welcome Jose Gallison. Jose, what's up, man?
Not much. Glad to be here. I have. We were just talking before about some big news I had with the show I'm going on tomorrow, but I also have big news with Tower Gang, which I will save that for your smoke-filled room portion because
all right.
That's a little bit more like not set in stone, so it's not stuff I want to publicly announce. But I think it's perfectly fitting for your smoke-filled room. But yeah, big news coming for Tower Gang. Hopefully.
Very much. All right. Well, do you want to break the other news then? Since we just want to get right to it.
Yeah, I'm on tinfoil hat with Sam Tripoli tomorrow.
I have no shame.
Yeah, and he just messaged me. I don't know if he's fucking with me or not, but he's saying Eddie Bravo's joining too, which is random, but I'm here for it.
All right. Well, as soon as you're done with this very podcast, however you're listening, go find Jose here on Sam Tripoli with Eddie Bravo, because that should be a hell of an experience no matter what.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. We'll probably somehow end up on flat earth on the topic of Oklahoma City bombing.
I have a feeling it might come up. So, Jose, before we dive into what you just mentioned there, we're going to dive into the Oklahoma City bombing, a subject that you've covered a bunch on your show. Why don't you just tell tell the little people and the big people alike, tell them all a little bit about yourself and what exactly it is you do there over at No Way Jose. And I guess you can mention the Tower Gang in case people don't know what the hell you're doing with that.
I'll tell the Owen Benjamins and the Jose Gallisons in the world, the tall people, short people. I have the No Way Jose show. I typically cover, that's really just like my outlet for talking about whatever the hell I want to talk about, really. I don't try to overly define it. I'm glad I wasn't, maybe it's a sore spot for you, but I'm glad I'm not someone who was one of those ones that are like, I'm the Liberty Hour or something. I'm sure that's a podcast, and I probably offended them. But
I'm sure it is. There's a Liberty everything, and it's somewhat my fault. But it's okay.
But I guess I just like the idea that I'm not really too. But generally speaking, that is kind of what I cover. But it's really whatever interests me, which tends to be libertarian theory, political analysis. I do a lot of live readings, so there's a lot of if you want to follow along, I'm in part 14 of Democracy: The God That Failed. If anyone's interested in that, the other stuff as well. But the thing, like you mentioned, true, I guess you could almost call them true crime conspiracies or conspiracies that typically have a government angle. I like the woo-woo conspiracies, but I don't really cover it in my show because I don't like it that much. I like it just as more like an entertainment thing, something to listen to for fun. I don't really get too deep into it in the analysis of that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing I've gotten probably known for was the Oklahoma City bombing. I want to be clear to your audience, I'm by no means an expert at all, so verify everything I say, but I've talked to a lot of experts. And I also am a podcaster, so I'm able to, I feel like, do a decent job of taking that and then, translating the information. But, verify all my stuff. Go check out my series. Go check out the OKC archive, the Libertarian Institute. It's literally like a Google. You can go in there, type in whatever thing you're thinking of. You can verify anything I said, and you can tell me where I was wrong or right or whatever. But, primarily I've done probably over 15 hours in the Oklahoma City bombing. I have a playlist on YouTube for those who are interested. There's a series, and I've done some additional content to go with it as well. But the main series was mostly with Richard Booth, who's basically the crypt keeper of the Oklahoma City bombing archives at the Libertarian Institute. He's kind of taken, somewhere near a decade of his, accumulating documents for the Libertarian, for the Libertarian Institute, but for the Oklahoma City bombing, anything related to that, and kind of putting it in one place. I believe it's the largest public archive there is. So yeah, go check that out for sure. Really useful, resource if you're trying to look into this stuff. But yeah, definitely if podcasting is the thing you want to do, if you want to check it out, I highly recommend that series. I think it's probably the best Oklahoma City bombing podcast series you're going to find. I believe it's 8 parts with a bonus part as well. So roughly 9 parts and then some additional stuff. So it's a long haul, but there's a lot in there, a lot. It is a huge, expansive story. I've been saying lately that I feel like the Oklahoma City bombing is almost like a modern day Rosetta Stone for understanding, conspiracies. Because once you start, there's a lot in there, and you start to see the playbooks in a lot of different organizations, and you can apply that to kind of the things we see today, and I know the deeper I dig down this hole, the more I find it to be interesting, the idea of how reality has been manipulated to give us a perception of things that maybe it's not quite exactly that way, and how that affects things over time. And that's why we have these crazy people freaking out about right-wing extremism. It's like, do we really have a right-wing extremism problem? I think the roots from that are kind of from things like the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah, it's interesting you call it sort of like a Rosetta Stone for conspiracies, because it's one of those things that there's enough sort of public information, enough things that are completely admitted to, completely open, that people can actually go to and see for themselves. Like you said, verify everything you say today, and you can. It's not so far out there that it's necessarily going to scare your dad away. It's not the moon landing, it's not flat Earth, it's not the kind of stuff that you might have to talk about with Eddie Bravo tomorrow. But it is one of those things that it can crack an eye open when people can see no matter what conclusion you reach, it's hard to dive into this and not reach a conclusion that something is very, very amiss with the entire situation.
Yeah, and it's a good, I feel like it's a good, kind of, it kind of subtly brings you into the deep waters of the stuff you're alluding to, the stuff you don't want to tell your dad about or whatever right off the bat. But once you start slipping in, you start digging it, then you start getting to things like MK Ultra. There's even weird remote viewing. There's, you start looking at the CIA connections, and that starts painting a very ominous picture of what this may have actually have been. Maybe it wasn't. At the very least, I've said many times the Oklahoma City bombing at the very least was like criminal ineptitude by federal agencies. But there is also a way to look at it.
The most generous possible.
The most generous possible. There is also definitely a way to look at it that, I don't know. Did Northwoods really end up sort of happening here? I don't know. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. There's things that suggest that. There's definitely some stuff that people would, offhand dismiss as kooky in the Oklahoma City bombing. But there are ways to present this to your dad, to where you're like, you can kind of give him to buy it and be like, hey, look at this.
Well, my dad listens to the show, so this is literally what we're doing today. We're presenting. Yeah. We could even title this "Presenting the Oklahoma City Bombing to My Dad." So why don't we just kind of start with maybe some of the basics, just because I actually pretty vividly remember this. I was 15. I'm a bit older than you. I'm guessing you probably don't really have a memory of it. What are you, 7 or 8 years younger than me ish?
Yeah.
I'm 42.
Yeah, I was born 91, so actually I was 4. So yeah, it was 4. Yeah.
It must have been like spring break or something like that, because I remember being home and seeing it on the news pretty much as it happened. And I think it's the first, because I'm pretty sure the first World Trade Center bombing was before that, but that was just like, oh, there was a bomb that went off, and it didn't feel like there was a lot of casualties that died. That's the first time I remember seeing on TV, like, real people die. I'm not putting in quotes because I'm not saying they're real, by the way. For anybody watching the video, real people dying on TV in a way that felt really like tragic and scary and confusing. And it's the first time I started to think a little bit about like, what does this mean? Like, what is going on here? So I'm curious. Obviously, you don't have memories of it, but maybe just try to start at the beginning of what you've found and what the. I guess maybe you can start with more of what the official story is, and then we can maybe try to find where the cracks are.
Yeah, well, the official story is that on April 19th, 1995, I want to say it was like 9-ish, might be a little bit off on the time, but it was early morning hours. Timothy McVeigh, this is the official narrative, Timothy McVeigh pulled up to the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and in a big old yellow Ryder truck, he walked out and, to get away, and then boom, exploded, and roughly around 170 people died. Now, like I said, that's the official narrative, roughly. Later we can go kind of like what the official narrative is so far as what McVeigh was. The term that we hear a lot, like the lone wolf, that is like kind of colloquialized by the whole McVeigh phenomenon, because they would typically refer to him as like a lone wolf thing, like he kind of was acting alone. Technically, people will kind of pull like a well, actually, for you when you say that, because it is part of the official narrative that Terry Nichols did help him. But when people are saying lone wolf, they mean like actually physically carrying out the act. Terry Nichols had an alibi. He was not there at the Oklahoma City at the time of the bombing. He did absolutely help. He did provide play a supportive role with like accumulating parts and different ins and outs. So he did help. But when people say lone wolf, they mean like literally did it. Like he supposedly drove up and did it. It was supposedly a result of him being disillusioned with the government from his time when he was in the Gulf War, and then subsequently, got out, kind of saw, kind of what the country was coming to, saw Waco, saw things like that, and kind of became radicalized against the government. And the way they typically portrayed it is that he saw it as like a war, and the idea that you took some of ours, and this is a federal building, so in his sense, kind of law of war type thing, this is perfectly legitimate, military target, despite the fact there are civilians there. And yeah, that's roughly kind of the general official narrative of what we're talking about with Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah, and there is like he had written some letters or something like that. There is like a Timothy McVeigh manifesto. I read some version of it that was put up by Gore Vidal in like the 90s, and I remember reading that. And he does sort of list like Ruby Ridge, Waco. He lists a series of grievances, and I mean, in some ways, kind of accurately describes a lot of the state of the government at the time. So there's definitely that narrative, in a sense, does seem to add up. He does seem to legitimately, perhaps, have these grievances against the U.S. government. Seemingly was absolutely involved in this attack. But then, so there's obviously a lot more to it, as there always is with this stuff. So maybe we can just start by focusing in on McVeigh a little bit more. Like, do you see his story as it's laid out as legitimate in sense of just his own grievances? Do you think he was truly an active participant, just as the story entails, or is there like maybe another angle to him that we're not looking at?
Well, first off, you mentioned that you read the letter. I want to be clear. People will frequently bring up, McVeigh said this, McVeigh said that. No, I'm not saying you were doing that or anything, but they will point to this letter or that statement to this person, that person. McVeigh's story changed like a bajillion times in a bajillion different ways. So you have to parse out everything he said with who did he say it to, at what time did he say it, what was the context, et cetera, et cetera. And so really, when it comes to McVeigh, to a lot of ways, in many ways, it is kind of like a pick your own story. The biggest divergence in a pick your own story of McVeigh would be when he went to Special Forces shortly after his time in Gulf War. When he got to the Gulf War, he went to go to Special Forces tryout. And according to him, and he said this to multiple people, he said it to his some of his defense attorneys. I think it was his first defense attorneys. He said it to his sister in a letter. He essentially said that to some people, certain people, that what really happened is instead of failing out of the Special Forces as what was the official narrative and what he also told other people, is he actually was pulled aside, and him and something like 10 or so other people were pulled aside and said, hey, we want you to be part of a covert unit of some sort, do different jobs, things like drug interdiction, like smuggling, even said things along the lines of like possible assassinations, stuff like that. And this is what he told his sister. So And he said it to other people at other times. And this letter, I believe, was actually 2 years prior to the bombing. So it wasn't even like a, I mean, I don't know. I guess, I don't know. You can kind of interpret that different ways depending on the timing of it. I don't know. I don't necessarily lean hard in one way or the other. To be clear, though, so that people know, the official story is he failed out of special forces within like a couple days. From his time in the Gulf War, apparently because he essentially went straight from the Gulf War to special forces training. He, I guess, had kind of messed up his feet a little bit, which sounds silly, but anyone knows like special forces training, you do a lot of rucking, a lot of moving around. If you have any issues with your feet, that is going to be a problem. So it is legitimate.
I don't even know what rucking is, but it sounds really fucking hard. So.
It's carrying like 40 to 100 pounds on your back and hauling for miles and miles and miles and miles. That's a pretty common thing they do in a lot of special forces training. A lot of, I don't know, anyone spent any time around any special forces guys know that's like pretty much one of the staples of it is the rucking. But yes, that is where there is one major divergence in which way you want to believe with McVeigh. In a sense, I feel like it sort of makes little difference. Obviously, if you can prove that he was a government agent, it does make a big difference. But so far as like the bombing, whether he did it or not, I don't think it makes much difference. I do think the evidence is pretty clear. It seems he almost certainly was, the main individual. He was ID'd by a ton of eyewitnesses. So I do think he is legit one of the people. But now, what story that paints a different story. I do think even if he wasn't a special forces, or he wasn't off in some sort of black ops type unit or some shit, I still think I still think he was manipulated by feds at the very least. Now, you can still have the government did it scenario and him not being a government agent because there are other individuals in this plot that fill the role just fine of government provocateurs.
And the term agent can have levels of meaning too, because you could be an agent and not kind of be a witting agent as well. You could just be someone who's manipulated. You could even have legitimate grievances and just be an unwitting dupe in the whole.
Yes, exactly. So I don't think it makes. I mean, obviously, it is like interesting, but in a certain sense, it almost makes little difference to me which way, because it's like it really is all we have to go on, because conveniently all the military records seem to disappear, or at least most of them. So a lot of stuff that could actually back up one way or the other is kind of absent. So really, it does pretty much
even the record that would show the true story, the official story that he dropped out is kind of unavailable.
I think a lot of if I remember, I actually was just reading the chapter in Aberration in the Heartland of Real that was covering a lot of that today, and if I remember correctly, that there may have been some sparse documents here and there, because there was a whole snafu between they were debating what day they actually dropped out of Special Forces, because it kind of makes a difference depending on, because the official story was that he was there for 2 days and then failed out and left, but then there seems to be some evidence that points towards maybe it was 5, which, obviously would lend a little bit more credence to the fact that some more, fishy stuff was going on. I don't know. You kind of get in the weeds when you start getting into the minutia of stuff like that. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of weird stuff going on there for sure.
I suppose you could imagine a scenario where there's a Timothy McVeigh that is playing the role he's supposed to play, maybe even stating the grievances, or if that's even him writing certain letters. I mean, who even knows? Playing the part, and then a McVeigh that is realized that he's fucked and is like saying, "Oh no, wait, no, hold on. They pulled me aside. I'm part of this unit," and starting to tell the truth to try to get another angle out of it.
Yeah, there's definitely something there. I because there is actually also in that one of the letters, because there's multiple letters to his sister. There was something along the lines of that he made it sound like he kind of tried to drop out, like essentially not. Because I kind of almost want to walk across there and grab the book to know for certain, because I have it bookmarked, but. It was something along the lines of God, a complete brain fart. What the fuck was I just talking about? Completely zoned out because I got sidetracked in that.
It'll come back.
No, what was the question again? I totally zoned out. What was the question?
We don't have questions here. We
threw me off. You don't remember the question. Oh, shit.
It's one long question. Tell me everything about OKC.
Yeah.
No, we were talking about McVeigh and whether he could have been like not telling the truth at first, or telling the truth at first in terms of playing the story he was supposed to tell, but then sort of bringing up the special forces thing and trying to sort of.
I remember exactly what I was going to say now. I was going to say that there was a contention about, or not contention, there was one of the letters to his sister he was talking about that essentially he decided he didn't want to follow through with the mission because there was, I think, something there along the lines of they want him to perpetrate some sort of attack or essentially pull off a sting, because that's something people say is a sting that went wrong. And he, there's this whole thing about how he essentially didn't want to do it and he was going to go on the run and all this. And obviously he ended up doing it. I think there may be, it's kind of hard to read exactly what happened because a lot of this is just, interpreted through letters during that period of time. Not a ton of solid evidence. But yeah, I also think maybe there is some component of, maybe sounds a little bit crazy. There's not a ton to, a conjecture on this, but I think there may be some MK Ultra stuff going on because it was recently confirmed. I don't know the specifics on it, but really, really legitimate researcher Wendy Painting recently came out with information. I don't remember the specifics, so go look into that, check it out on how she confirmed this. But apparently, Jolly West had met with Timothy McVeigh. Now, prior to this information coming out from her, we already knew that Jolly West was essentially on the case, if you will. But he wasn't known to have interacted directly with McVeigh. He was on board, kind of helping out victims with, kind of trauma therapy or something. Which I'm assuming you're familiar with Jolly West, the MK Ultra guy.
He's one of these like MK Ultra psychiatrists that conveniently shows up at all the places you expect him to.
He's like the MK Ultra guy. And even then, prior to knowing he met directly with McVeigh, we already knew his protege John Smith, who's another MK Ultra doctor, had already met with McVeigh. So now we know for a fact he's met with John Smith, Jolly West's protege, and also Jolly West himself. So now it makes you wonder, especially if anyone who's looked into MK Ultra and kind of what the goals of MK Ultra were. One of the big ones were creating split personalities. So
both versions of him could be telling the truth.
Yes, they could both exist.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know. That is a lot of conjecture in that one. The only things we have to really go on that is the fact that Jolly West and his dude were there. But that is a big one because anyone who's Jolly West, it's very fishy that he would show up to just, even with the earlier story that was confirmed of it was that he hadn't met with McVeigh, but he was interacting with the victims of the bombing to help with their trauma. It already is like his whole point of MK Ultra was manipulating trauma to their benefit. So I don't know. What they did with that, I can only conjecture. I have no idea. But it seems really odd. The guy who specializes in manipulating trauma shows up to talk to a bunch of people who experience a lot of trauma. So, yeah. Something there. I don't know. Something to ponder. Because, if you're trying to understand the actions of McVeigh, that could totally play into it. Because maybe he did try to run away or something. And I don't know. I have no idea. How the intricacies of how MK Ultra would work in the 90s. Because go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, let's dig into some more of these aspects because one thing I do remember pretty vividly as well from the early days was this talk of this John Doe number 2, and they even had the drawings of him and everything. And I remember at one point they were even trying to suggest he might have been an Iraqi guy because it's not that long after the Gulf War. And then suddenly that just went away. So is there anything to John Doe number 2? And if so, do you think that it went away suddenly for a reason?
Oh, absolutely. Like we mentioned before, the Oklahoma City bombing happened April 19th. By May, there were already internal FBI memos where they were essentially telling them to put all leads into abeyance, which is a fancy law enforcement term for don't pursue these leads, essentially. And then May, June, and then June, the official story of the FBI became that John Doe 2 was imagined. Meanwhile, every single person that they talked to that saw McVeigh saw him with another person that day. There were, I believe, 22. I know it was over 20 eyewitnesses who saw him with another person. If I remember correctly, there was one that the feds ended up getting to use for some part of their trial that initially had said he saw both and later said he only saw one. So, but none of the other people who saw both seemed to get called to stand at all, which is, I don't know, that's convenient. But yeah, so there's definitely a lot to the John Doe 2. It's my suspicion it's likely was either a Fed, an informant, or someone that for whatever reason the Feds did not want pursued. Whether he had information that may make them look bad, I don't know. Now, so far as the Middle Eastern stuff, yes, it was. If you look at the eyewitness reports and their descriptions of him, they did describe him. I typically refer to him as like ethnically ambiguous. So, and there were some weird eyewitness reports about like they're essentially being Hajis of some sort, Middle Easterns. I did find it. I was recently just looking through the FOIAs, a lot of the Freedom of Information Act requests that came out of this, all the Oklahoma City bombing stuff, and I came across one that was about a remote viewing one, and it was a memo from the CIA, which it was like shortly after the bombing or something along those lines. I forget that they, or maybe it was supposed to be prior. I forget the specifics of it. I'm just bringing it up because it's just funny.
The remote viewing is one of those ones that I always want to shelve it in like that's just too weird and probably not true category, but then it always keeps coming up in actual CIA documents. So then you're like, well, what? So are they just fucking around? Or like, because if they're saying it, then someone must think it's a real thing. Or are the documents just, these are the kind of thoughts that we go through.
My thoughts is, I don't know, I typically lean towards remote viewing's probably not real, but even if it is real, now, like I was saying with these FOIAs, this came from the CIA. These were CIA memos from their remote viewers. So, and immediately it came out, it was like some Middle Easterns, I forget it was Palestinians, Israelis, Saudis. Not Israelis, obviously they wouldn't put any blame on them, but, Palestinians, Iranians, Saudis, I forget which group they were conjecturing it was, but essentially it was remote viewer going, nah, this is what I think I see. It's the CIA remote viewer, and that's what one of the first pieces of information to come out. I don't know, that reads to me like maybe Middle Easterner was the initial, like, oh, this is maybe what we're going with, and maybe that fell through. Get the remote viewing guy
to tell him it was some Middle Eastern looking guys.
Exactly. I don't, when it's conveniently the narratives they want to push, some people conjecture that this may have been their attempt to like kick off the terror wars early, and then maybe the narrative kind of fell apart, and they scrapped together the white supremacist narrative.
Or maybe they didn't know. They had one of each. They had Timothy McVeigh, they had the Middle Eastern John Doe, and they're like, we'll figure it out later. We'll just blame one.
Yeah, and it also could just be a matter of agencies not talking to each other. And even with this, they went with this or went with that. This doesn't even presuppose they did it, to be clear, because a lot of people made like, oh, being conspiratorial. This could be it completely happened, and they just go through the Rolodexes of like, well, who do we blame this on? What do we need to blame this on right now? Who knows? I don't know how this works. But point being is that I'm not by saying that, you're not asserting that they actually did it. Although I think there is there's legitimate speculation to be had that they possibly did do it. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything more on that. I think I kind of addressed what we were just talking about. But totally.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to kind of look at a couple of these, because there's a lot of stuff we can dig into on the bombing on the day itself that maybe we'll circle back to. But I think some of the strangest aspects of this case can be looked at through the cases of two other people, Kenneth Trenadue and Terrence Yeakey, someone whose name you got to bring up on Timcast in front of hundreds of thousands of people. The Terrence Yeakey didn't kill himself shirt. So maybe you can start with whichever one you think is I don't know, they're both important obviously, but whichever one you think is maybe more relevant to just show us that there's obviously, when you follow some of these trails, you start to say, okay, besides the bombing itself, this is like, okay, something major is going on here.
Yeah, I'll start with Terrence, because I think because we're kind of at this spot right now where we're talking kind of like what happened, and I think there's a good way to attack this Yeakey story and kind of get at what may have gone on in this realm, and Kenneth, I think it does a better job of getting more into like the Fed corruption. So yeah, Terrence Yeakey. He was a cop. He was one of the first spawners to the Oklahoma City bombing. I've many reports say he was the first. I think he was probably the first from many of the accounts I've heard. But I always say one of, because I don't know if he was literally the first or one of the first few. But he was, doing some sort of traffic ticket, very close by. Heard the boom, immediately came running. Was one of the first people saving people. Saved over 3 lives. Became injured himself in the process. I think he was kind of carrying a big dude. Fell through a couple floors. Hurt his back. His ex-wife at the time, she came to pick him up. The first thing he said to her was, "Tanya, it's not what they're saying. They're not telling the truth." She's actually done a radio interview for people. Tanya Yeakey, that's who she is. That was his ex-wife. They were kind of in a spot at that time where they seemed to be rekindling things, because a lot of the stuff because we'll kind of get to that, this guy, spoiler alert, he ends up dying. They blame it on suicide. And one of the main points I'm mentioning about Tanya that they try to lean on was the fact that, try to make it out like there were family problems, when in reality it looked like they were actually rekindling things in a great spot at the time. But anyways, she picked him up from the hospital. He said that, according to her, with tears in his eyes, said, "Tony, it's not what they're not what they're saying it is. They're not telling the truth. They're lying about what's going on down there." Like I said, he ends up dying. Roughly a year later, his body was found in a field near El Reno. His wrists and throat were cut. There was grass and dirt in the wounds. There was what looked like rope burns and cuff bruises on his feet and wrists. And a bullet had gone through his head they come in from the back of the head. Well, more of like an angle, kind of like the I don't know if it was left or right, but we'll go with left for the sake of convenience. But kind of like top left angle, coming down kind of like in his like front right lower jaw. It would be a good way to put it, or vice versa. For sides, I forget which side it came from. But point being, so people can understand the trajectory. And his body was found, roughly a mile. The lowest estimates I've heard is half mile. The highest I've heard is a mile and a half. He was found from his car, which was covered in blood. And this was ruled a suicide almost immediately. So here we have a dude who has extensive damage to his body. The key point being the car, which is about roughly a mile away, with all the blood. So it, obviously he had to get from one point to another. This guy was also sickle cell anemic. So, the fact that he would do, and, according to the reports, it was like covered in blood. And when they found the body, he had lost over 2 pints of blood. So he had done extensive damage in the car. And so we're to believe that he did all this damage to himself, walked, a half mile,
dragged
to a mile
himself
and a half.
out of the desert.
Yeah, and there have been people who have looked have went down the path, and they say it's very very like creeks, fences, very lot of obstacles in the way. And
even if you were going to kill yourself in some weird, gruesome way where you also tied your own wrists behind your back, and why would you also put yourself through the torture of being out in the desert on top of it?
Yeah, no, for sure. It makes no sense. There was also no autopsy performed. There was no suicide note. I don't believe we ever got any details about ballistics.
There was no autopsy. So who declared it a suicide? Was it the local police?
There was the police when they got there. The funny thing is, that body was actually discovered by the Canadian County Police Department, which was essentially right next to the Oklahoma City Police Department, which was the department Terrence worked for. Weirdly, they didn't rule it a suicide, the Canadian County, but shortly after, not too much longer after, the OCPD, the Oklahoma City Police Department, took over for the Canadian County. I've heard people explain this before. That's not uncommon for larger departments to take over for smaller departments for the logic of the fact
for a routine suicide.
Yeah, for better resources and such. And I can understand why the Canadian County would let them too, because they'd be like, oh, that's your guy, your cop. You probably want to take care of this if you can. But they ruled it a suicide. Another fun fact: the gun wasn't found until the OCPD took over the crime scene. Which, if you shot yourself in the head,
shouldn't have gone far, right?
Unless you have some crazy spastic, from, I don't know, which would make sense, I guess, from getting shot in the head, you might have some muscle spasms. Even then, the furthest you're going to be able to throw it is like 10 feet from some sort of muscle spasm. So they would have found it. Apparently, they combed the area and didn't find it, and it wasn't until the OCPD took over jurisdiction that, lo and behold, they found a gun. But like I said, we never got any ballistics on the gun. We don't know the specifics on whose gun or what gun it was, whose it was, which you would think, if it was Terrence's gun, we would know this, because... which brings up another key point. There was an individual named Ramona McDonald who he talked to, she made the claim that he told her he made the choice not to bring his service weapon, and kind of obviously the logic being they were worried about getting suicide, because he had talked to this Ramona character about that he was going to go meet with a couple suits types, a couple official looking types, essentially bringing some of the stuff he'd accumulated, because apparently he had been looking for people to talk to about this. Keep in mind, this is the mid-'90s. He wasn't able to start a podcast and tell the world.
If only he had only waited a decade, he could have just had a blog and then later in a podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he to him this was his big chance. He clearly thought these were some sort of 3-letter agency types that maybe he can get him to, but he also wasn't completely stupid, and obviously didn't bring his gun with him. Likely concerned that if they were going to do something, that they would do it with his own weapon, because that would make sense. He didn't bring it, and still ended up dead. The ballistic, like I said, we never found out about the gun, the ballistics, any of that. So that would track with, maybe not being his gun, because you'd think we'd know that. And obviously, then the question goes like, why did he get killed? What did he possibly know? What are they covering up? We, like I alluded to before, kind of a sting gone wrong. That could be possibility. The Ramona character I talked to earlier, one of the, many, probably one of the better resources people refer to frequently is a letter from Terry to this character Ramona, which I believe, if I remember correctly, this was, something that was gotten from the family later. So that's how you can, kind of, determine how well you want to trust this source or not. And I'll go ahead and read a small portion. Dear Ramona, I hope that whatever you hear now in the future will not change your opinions about myself or others with the Oklahoma City Police Department. Although some of the things I'm about to tell you about is very disturbing. I don't know if you recall everything that happened that morning or not, so I'm not sure if you know what I'm referring to. The man that you and I were talking about, the pictures I have, made the mistake of asking too many questions as to his role in the bombing and was told to back off. I was told by several officers he was an ATF agent who was overseeing the bombing plot, and the time the photos were taken, he was just calling his report of what he had just went down. I think my days as a police officer are numbered because of the way my supervisors are acting, and there is a lot of secrets floating around about my mental state of mind. I think they're going to write me up because of my ex-wife and a VPO. And so, obviously it's kind of alluding to in that little portion that he seems that maybe he thinks there's more going on here. Maybe he saw something. He said he had seen this individual named Lucas Franey, who was an ATF agent, and it seems, obviously we don't know, he didn't spell it out specifically exactly, but there's something going on there. There's also reports from his sister, LaShawn Hargrove, that said she had talked to Terry before, Terrence, and he had said things about how he saw evidence of what looked like explosives blowing out as opposed to blowing in, because it was as I said earlier, there was a truck bomb, and if this truck bomb had got parked next to the building, if it blew up, it would blow things in towards the building. And according to LaShawn, he seemed to have seen things that made it look like there were actually some sort of force pushing outwards.
Indicating that there could have potentially been either maybe another bomb already in the building.
Yes.
Weren't there some initial reports, and I think the stuff is always chalked up to like the confusion or the chaos of the day, of people finding other bombs and things like that in the initial sort of like police scans? Or am I thinking something?
No, there was the rescue efforts were called off multiple times that day for bomb scares.
Right.
So there were multiple reports of seeing bombs. It's kind of hazy what actually really happened. Some people will say, oh, they just were misidentified, some things or whatever. There are actual photos of the ATF bomb squads, taking boxes out and stuff. There's a picture said a box containing an unarmed tow missile, anti-tech weapon, a tank weapon, and other stuff. So many people presume that this could be, on the easier way, on the lighter on the ears way of explaining this phenomenon, is there was what seemed to be the reports of that the ATF may have been storing explosive munitions improperly in this federal building. This federal building that had a daycare in it, had a social security office in it, had like military recruiters, had other stuff in it as well. But this is a spot where apparently they decided to store explosive equipment there. And so one of two things could have happened. Maybe he had seen unexploded ordnance, or Yeakey had seen unexploded ordnance of it, or he had seen, evidence of it actually blowing out. They could have also not have gone off, and that's where the bomb scares came from, and they got them all out. But so that's one way to explain possible, other explosions or just the bomb scares. It could have been that some of those munitions got exploded, and obviously maybe they're not fessing up to it, or they didn't get exploded, and those bomb scares were simply just due to whatever thing that they thought may have looked like a bomb. I mean, they still could have been storing stuff improperly, and none of it went off. But point being is that's one way to explain some of this. There also, on the other hand, there were reports of what looked like how do I say this? There were two individuals, Ruth Schaub and Jane Graham, who have a report that sounds like they may have seen people that were hooking up explosive. The way they saw it looked like that they had people that were planting, wiring, thin wiring, and other little things up to columns and stuff in the parking garage. So that would lend itself to maybe someone was planting explosives. That would be on the other end of the range of possibilities.
That definitely would be more planted more in the MyHop side, the make it happen more so than the let it happen.
Yep. And one of those individuals too, I forget which one, if that was Ruth or if that was Jane. Later on, I believe it was on an Alex Jones show. Actually, she said she identified one of the individuals as Strassmeyer. I know a lot of people, some people poo-poo at that. I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion one or the other because that was the only time her story changed when she went on Alex Jones. I don't know. It doesn't really matter either way. But either way, it's interesting. She did even brought up the name of Strassmeyer in regards to it because he's another individual that kind of like I was saying earlier with McVeigh, like whether he was a glowy or not, there were other glowies that were doing glowy stuff, and Strassmeyer was one of them. I guess we can jump on Strassmeyer if you want, but I guess I was jumping from one topic to the other, and so I don't know if there's more you want to talk about Yeakey.
No, you can dive into Strassmeyer.
Yeah, Strassmeyer. That is a interesting fellow. Strassmeyer was a German national.
Oh boy.
He came over.
These guys are always popping back up.
Yeah. He was a German national. He was the son of like a high-powered politician. He was in the German military. He was in a counter recon or counter intel in there. He also did a little stint where he looked like it was maybe like a cross-training thing with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. So he was kind of doing patrols with them for a while over there in Israel. And then he came over to, I'm talking on my ass a little bit, I want to say it was around like 93, maybe it was earlier, but it was well before the bombing, a good, years before the bombing, he came over. And one of the first people he stayed with was this individual named Vincent Petruski, who is heavily alluded that he was a CIA agent at one point, and he was part of Operation Phoenix, which that was essentially Operation Northwoods carried out in Vietnam. During that kind of era when we were, fucking around in Vietnam. So that was the first guy he stayed with in the States, was this Vincent Petruski guy. Probably the only other interesting thing about Vincent Petruski that's merited bringing up now is the fact that with Vincent, apparently there was talks that he was trying to hook up he was essentially assisting Andreas Strassmeyer with making packages for different federal agencies to for work essentially. So that was something that came out there. Now obviously who did he end up working for? What did he end up doing later? I don't know. He ends up moving to Texas shortly later. Lives with this individual named David Holloway, who is another, he was essentially a CIA pilot. He was like a cutout with maybe it was like Evergreen. I forget what specific cutout it was, but one of those ones he's a CIA agent. Like, let's be real. Like, that's what he is. And he, he lived with him for a while over in Texas, and David Holloway was
just roommates, I'm sure.
Yeah, David Holloway was in the had essentially started the Texas Light Infantry, or was running it at that time. Brought Strassmeyer over there to be a part of that infantry, or not infantry, but that militia. It wasn't too much longer. Strassmeyer got booted out of that militia because they suspected of being a provocateur. Because apparently some of the individuals got a little bit were a little suspicious of him, and so some individuals followed him after kind of at the end of the day, and they saw him going to a federal building at night and using the key code to get in, and that's when they're like, no, you can get out. And so that's when they kicked him out. Keep in mind this was the militia being run by his buddy David Holloway, who was a former CIA agent. And then he ends up showing up in Elohim City, which is kind of where this comes back full circle, which was kind of this like, hodgepodge of weird religious kooks, white supremacists, kind of some right-wing folks, but generally kind of known as being a seedy, kind of white power movement area. And that's where Strassmeyer ended up at with those individuals there. All during this time where he's...
it's funny how these things just all happen to overlap.
Yeah, and he was receiving also during that time a $2,000 a month stipend from this Holloway character the whole time he's here, which if I remember correctly, I believe it was for, under the auspices.
Roommates got to help each other out.
Yeah.
Totally lines up.
I think it was on the auspices of like some sort of computer job or some shit, which he obviously wasn't doing. But, just kind of an excuse to give him money. And so, yeah, that's when he ends up in Elohim City, and he runs into McVeigh multiple times. He only ever cops up to one meeting with McVeigh, although McVeigh is associated with a bunch of other people that, are in groups that Strassmeyer is associated with. They actually... I believe one of the times they interviewed Strassmeyer, he literally had McVeigh's BDUs hanging up in his, which is like his military uniform, hanging up in his closet, and he claimed that was from the one time he met him at a gun show, and I guess kind of bought him off him, thought that was cool. He gave him his card. He gave him the card for Elohim City because if I remember correctly, I believe that part of how that came out is probably Strassmeyer trying to justify that McVeigh was on record calling over. At one point to the in the rough time, very close to the time of the bombing, whether it was before or after, I can't recall, calling over to Elohim City looking for Andreas Strassmeyer. So it's like, how do you explain this guy calling over for you? Have your BDUs? Oh, we just met that one time. But there's also there's multiple people who've seen him. There's an individual who was a whistleblower for PatCon, John Matthews, who claimed he saw McVeigh and Strassmeyer together at a separate occasion. Which PatCon was like an FBI op. Many people think it's associated with Oklahoma City bombing. There's also the Godivas, whatever, the essentially strip club that him, McVeigh, and Strassmeyer were spotted at, and another individual named Michael Brescia. They were spotted there about roughly, I want to say it was like 2 weeks before the bombing. This is actually...
Why do they always go to strip clubs before the terrorist attacks? The 9/11 guys too? It's like part of the ritual, it seems like.
Yeah, just partying. And there was
you may
one,
as well, right? Yeah. Whether you're a patsy or not.
Yeah, and there was one girl, there was multiple strippers there that ID'd them. And, they ID'd the, Strassmeyer, McVeigh, that they were there. And it was McVeigh, that said to one of them, which this is actually can be found in a few different places. There's video footage of it. I showed it on my show because they found it from a dressing room footage from the strip club of the strippers talking about it. And one of the strippers was talking to the other one that this one guy said to me that on April 19th, you'll remember my name for the rest of your life. And that was like kind of like the key point, obviously calling out the day that it was happening. Before it happened, she was just kind of laughing about what a goofball saying this. This was before the bombing, obviously. And then later...
feels like that almost feels like an MK Ultra. Make sure you tell people on April 19th, like make sure your name's out there.
Yeah, maybe. Although one of those strippers, Sean T. Farrens, ended up dead. It was reported as a suicide. There were some sources that said there was some sort of bloody handprint there. I don't know how legit that is. Either way, it was super convenient she died.
Terrence Yeakey's handprint.
Yes. Either way, it's super convenient she died. So I don't know. Maybe it could have been completely legit because it was attributed to a drug overdose. Did I say suicide earlier? Drug overdose. But, it could have been a drug OD suicide. But, so I don't know. Strippers, let's be real. I don't know. They could have totally been heroin. I don't know. But it also could have been the feds offing her because she was talking too much. I have no idea. There are a lot of weird deaths surrounding this once you start digging in. And some of them you can kind of explain away. But it also is like, when you get this many bodies, it's kind of like, oh, I don't know. I'm not going to just, take everyone for granted.
That's often a hallmark of these events, too, whether it's JFK, probably one of the original conspiracies or, anything else. When you really start honing in on it, it's not just the event itself that seems weird, but then you find all these people related to it, and you can just follow different sort of rabbit trail. It's almost like a little star, the spraying out of the main event are all these little side events that all, even if you can't figure out every single one, they all tell you, okay, 40 weird things surrounding one event tells you something weird is going on here, even if we don't know exactly what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that probably makes a good transition if we're talking about bodies that dropped, and we can probably move on to Kenneth to kind of, that'd probably be the good place to go next. Kenneth was, second crap, I'm trying to bring up my notes on it real quick so I don't fuck up anybody. But yeah, Kenneth was a dude who, did a little bit of time in the military, got out. This is around the Vietnam War time. When he got out, came out with a heroin addiction, and to fund his addiction, he robbed a couple banks, got busted in one of them, did his time, got out. Then he kind of got his life back together. He got married, had a kid, had a newborn. And the thing with him is he was on parole when he got out. One of the conditions of his parole was that he couldn't drink. And I guess he made a big stink about that. And he was kind of like, hey, I'm going to drink. He had his brother, Jesse Trenadue, who was a lawyer. He got to help him out with a lot of this. And he tried to go the legal route to get it so that he, could still drink and still, be on parole. Because he pretty much was like, yeah, I'm not going to pay that. So if we could find a way to waive that, it'd be cool.
I'm good with everything else, but
yeah, exactly.
All right.
So they threw it out. Well, no, they didn't throw it out. And he then was like, okay, well, I'm just going to stop showing up because you're going to test my piss. It's going to have alcohol in it, and I'm not going to drop drinking alcohol. So come get me if you want. And they just never kind of got it and get him. Never kind of came and got him. I said that weird. But yeah, then at one point when he was crossing the Mexican border, he had his wife was Mexican, so he had family there. So I'd presume they were probably visiting family or something along those lines. And at that point, crossing the border, I guess that's when they flagged him and they go, oh, geez, this is a guy who's, skipped out on parole. And so then they end up, taking him in. He ends up, in a. I also do want to remind people this is happening around the time of the John Doe 2 hunt, the big hunt for John Doe 2, and there, he kind of fit the description on multiple levels. This Kenneth guy, he was suspected to have John Doe 2 was suspected to have fled to Mexico. Because obviously I would assume they probably presumed trying to get the hell out of the country after doing something like that. They presumed he either fled to Mexico or Canada. Kenneth had a very similar build. He was kind of a stocky fella, because John Doe 2 was described as being somewhere in the range of like 5'7", 5'10"-ish, kind of stocky. He was, noted multiple times as being a very thick neck, kind of bullheaded guy, kind of that ethnically ambiguous. So either like a white guy with darker skin or like a light-skinned, dark guy or Hispanic or something like that. And Kenneth was kind of like a, dark-skinned white guy, kind of got a lot of sun, obviously. He also was driving a similar pickup truck at the time to what John Doe 2 was suspecting of having. And the biggest thing was the forearm, or the tattoo on Kenneth's left forearm, which was a dragon, which, albeit it was a super generic 90s dragon tattoo. So, normally when people have the same exact tattoo, you'd be like, oh my God. But considering as, it was kind of like literally looked like 90s flash art dragon, sort of semi-Japanese dragon. I don't know. I don't really feel like.
And was John Doe 2 described so clearly that they were even pointing out a similar tattoo then?
Yes, they had pointed out a tattoo that was kind of what people had described roughly. Keep in mind these are composite, between a bunch of different eyewitnesses. So when we're saying someone looks like John Doe 2, it's within reason because a lot of people have suspected all sorts of different people that kind of fit semi different types. Because when someone says, "Oh yeah, they're buff," I mean, I don't know. You could be talking about a 160-pound guy that's kind of got a good kind of lean, or you could be talking about a 200-pound guy.
Schwarzenegger, a guy that's slightly more muscular than you.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a range, and he seemed to kind of fit that. He then ended up in Oklahoma. They transported him to Oklahoma to the Federal Transfer Center to hold there while apparently they were figuring out what was going on with him. He then ended up, quote unquote, committing suicide, just like Yeakey. He was found according to the prison, he was found hanging from a bedsheet. But when the family received the body back, it had extensive cuts, bruises, burns all over him. There were also 2 other inmates that said they heard sounds that sounded like torture, like screams, stuff like that. Those 2 individuals died before they could testify in court because they both had agreed to Jesse Trenadue, who was Kenneth's brother.
Those trails that just come off.
And those 2. One of them they chalked up as a suicide. He was found hanging as well. Another one they called a drug overdose. Once again, they could have been a suicide, could have been a drug overdose. It just when it adds up, it's like I know it's worth noting. And there was another individual. There was a videographer who was a videographer they used that was like the expert on the Rodney King case, like the legal expert for like videographer type reasons. The FBI contacted him to look through their kind of like their video system that they use, their like surveillance video system, to ask him essentially because key point, the video footage disappeared from that night. because he was in a high security part of the prison.
Another staple of a lot of this stuff is disappearing footage.
Yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned he wasn't before this. He was in a high security part of the prison, which is also kind of weird. This guy was a model prisoner. Why was he in the high security part? I don't know. But this videographer I was telling you about, the FBI came to him, asked to get his expert analysis on if there was any way. With this footage, they brought him the equipment, whatever the hell they used. If there was any way that this could have been anything other than it being like manually removed, and he said no. It would have. After looking at his expert opinion, was that it was nope. This was had to have been done manually. Someone had to remove the video or whatever method they used to get rid of it. Someone had to physically do it. It wasn't just some anomaly. And when the FBI asked them to do this, they made it very clear they didn't want a written report. They only wanted an oral report. And then after that, they were kind of like, okay, thank you for the time. Don't talk to anybody about this, and kind of disappeared. He later came to Jesse Trenadue, told him this story, and said, hey, I'd be willing to testify because this doesn't really sit right with me. He died. So yes, that's so I think that's what 3 people plus maybe
a stripper or 2.
Yeah, plus a stripper, then Ken. Now here's another. A lot of people assume that maybe that he had been mistaken for this individual named Richard Lee Guthrie, which is another character who plays into a lot of these different people, kind of in the group of like the Strassmeyer that I was telling you about earlier, kind of in that those Elohim City type people. He was kind of in that group of people, Richard Lee Guthrie. He was already in prison around this time. This guy committed suicide as well, and he was on record saying that he was going to essentially work with the authorities and the press and stuff, and he was going to essentially blow the lid open on the Oklahoma City bombing case, and
Guthrie
he died. Yeah, and it was actually McVeigh himself, according to Jesse Trenadue, who contacted him through what means I don't know, because this was at a time when McVeigh was still alive and in prison. He contacted Jesse to tell him that he believed the FBI mistook him for Richard Lee Guthrie, which like I said, many people believe was John Doe 2. I mean, whether he actually was or John Doe 2 or not, being as his role in the case, I think that they were probably looking for him regardless of whether he was John Doe 2 or not. So just because, like I said, a lot of people believe
That's
that.
I always try to wrap my head around with the Trenadue is why were they torturing him, trying to get information out of him of some kind, thinking he actually was this Guthrie, and then there's like maybe multiple sides working against each other in some way. That's the one part I'm always like, so why would they torture him even if he was him?
Yeah, with him that is weird, and I've talked to my my subject matter expert Richard Booth on this, and he brings up the point, and I think it's an important point for especially a lot of us conspiracy guys to keep in mind, that none of these agencies operate as a monolith. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of times we have this tendency to be like, oh yeah, this agency wants this and this agency wants that, and then we kind of like give it this own like idea of like, oh yeah, this entity is moving in unison like this, and it's like, no, that's not how it works. So like
there's various agencies, but then there's various people and units with their own motivations within those agencies too.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these like shadowy figures that a lot of us conspiracy people will talk about, like, oh, this guy, that guy. Those are probably like of maybe a few dozen out of these groups, and probably this information is probably compartmentalized so much that really only them and maybe a few other dozen people know this stuff, anyways. So I think a lot of the like that say with like the FBI, a lot of these probably are just your normal on the beat guys that are just
normal on the beat, the guys that would torture the suspect, doing normal suspect torturing, and then they're like, oh shit, that's not even that guy.
And even then, there's levels to that. So they could be like kind of, willing to do stuff like that, but still not be at that level where they're completely in the know. Or they could have just been looking for Richard Lee Guthrie or looking for someone who fit that role, knowing that they need to clean up. I don't know.
They could be patriotic Americans, in quote, that just took it too far with a guy who they really thought killed all these people.
Yes, exactly. So I don't know. There is when you get into like the John Doe 2s and stuff, that would probably be a conversation I need to have more with Richard Booth about that, because I think there is. It always does kind of confuse me too, because I really don't think Richard Lee Guthrie is John Doe 2, and I actually think he probably, I would assume he probably had a similar build to Kenneth. But I don't know. I do have the feeling it was probably a little bit of a darker fella, and he probably was some sort of ethnic ambiguous from the reports I've seen. But I don't know. I'm just nitpicking. It's hard to tell who's what. But yes, I don't think they operate as a monolith. And this was also after the period of time when the official story was there was no John Doe 2. But then they would also make conflicting reports to the media that they were still looking into it while saying it was made up. It was they were in a weird spot at that point, the FBI, with their official narrative.
We've ruled it out, but we're going to leave it open-ended in case we decide to change our story later.
Yeah. So there could have been people that were in the know for whatever reason, had bad information, or maybe they were, I don't know, they could have gone after, or it could have been people trying to continue to look into this after they had been told not to look into it anymore. It's really hard to tell, because there's differing levels of information and who has what. Information can get skewed along the way. Everyone's operating on whatever information they have, and that's that.
All right, well, Jose, we'll wrap up in a minute, and maybe we'll dig a little more into this in the smoke-filled room. But really, I mean, like you said earlier, you just yourself have done like 15 hours of podcasts on this. But then each of these people you've brought on and talked to have their own, treasure trove of. We've only really scratched the surface on this topic, but it is an important one, I think, as you kind of said at the top, to bring it full circle. It really is one that can crack open the sort of the pathway, the framework for what a lot of similar events can look like. And I think when it comes to identifying whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it a false flag, or I think the most generous thing, like you said, might be to say it was just a really, really corrupt situation. But really, I think we can both agree at minimum, they let this occur in some way, shape, or form, most likely. But either way, the point is you can spot all of these little signs surrounding the event. And once you learn to see that, which you can see so much of it with the Oklahoma City bombing, you can start to see it in other places too. That kind of helps you identify this type of event, which I think is pretty useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
So one thing I want to ask you, though, before we wrap up, just to get your brief thoughts on is, a lot of people might be hearing, okay, this definitely sounds like there's some shenanigans here. Maybe this is something I haven't looked into, but then they're going to pause and think, well, why? Like, why would any element of federal, and again, there's, like you said, there's not moving at a monolith. So there might be one agency or one thing with one motivation that goes against another. But at the end of the day, why would anyone do this? Why would any government agency whatever do this might mean? And that's open to interpretation again. It might just mean cover it up after the fact. It might just mean allow it to happen. It might mean, as far as doing the wires and making it all happen, who knows? But either way, why would something be amiss, I guess? What are some possible motivations?
I guess I'll answer that two different ways, because I'll answer that on one hand on the let it happen / or somehow we drop the ball type thing. Why would this happen? Because all the incentives are in place for that to happen. Because we have these agencies that are allowed to, and it's pretty much common practice for them to infiltrate groups to get into them. Now, at what point? What's the sliding scale between infiltrate and just be there to take on information, or where does that become becoming a provocateur or legitimizing the group? Like, for example, it's become quite known that a lot of them start these groups and then kind of put them together. So, like, let's say me and you made a club that was the I Hate Women Club, but it was totally just an op, and we really like women, but we're gonna get me, you, and like 5 other of our buddies to be in the I Hate Women Club, even though we love women, but then we're going to use that to point to the world. We'll get 2 other people who really do hate women, and we'll point to the world like, look at this group of 9 people, and they hate women. Look how bad hating women is in our society. You know what I mean? When it's really like, okay, but like over half of you don't actually believe that, and you just have skewed the concept.
7 of you are part of the thing, and 2 of you are the dumbest people you could find that you convinced to join this dumb thing.
Yes, exactly. So now, the incentives are there, and what happens? Let's say that Oklahoma City bombing was some sort of op gone wrong, and let's say that the plan was to stop it in the nick of time and put this guy in jail and be like, look at us, we saved the day, and we did a bomb sting. We completely set this guy up, gave him the money, gave him the means, gave him everything.
Once again, gave him real bombs, as always seems to be the case again.
Yeah, and say they stopped it. Now what happens? They get a pat on the back, and they're gonna go, you know what? We should get some look how great we did. You give us some perks, maybe give us more money, whatever. It just makes them look better in general. Now what happens on the other hand? Then they go, well, we clearly don't have the resources to deal with this. Maybe if we were able to get this program or that program, obviously they find
pass
their own
this law or that law might help.
Yeah. So if anything, you could almost make a case there's more of an incentive for them to screw up than there is for them to do well, because what do you really get other than an attaboy from when you do well? So, but at the very least, it kind of gives you less of an incentive to not fuck up, because it's like, meh, whatever. Like, I don't know. So it leaves more open for those situations. But on the other extreme side, on the make it happen, why would they do that? Now, I think this requires not a myopic view, a honed-in view on specific things. People always have this tendency to go, okay, so let's say X event was completely put on by the government. Well, why would they do it? What happened? Were there any laws? Were there this, that? Like, they're looking for a direct action, direct result. Like, this thing happened, and then this law got put into effect. I don't think how that works. Especially if you look throughout history and a lot of these things work. A lot of times, like when you look at things like Operation Gladio, things that actually went through, or things like Operation Phoenix over in Vietnam, it is more of a big picture view, and like what generally happens when these large mass trauma events happen. How does the public react? How can we manipulate this? How does this benefit us? To whose arms they run to? Stuff like that. This is how we maintain control. This is how, and yes, there also is the element of then we can get X, Y, and Z in, but it doesn't have to be we perform this action and then ta-da, we get the whatever the 2023 act of getting rid of firearms. Like,
right. It's not just for this one specific thing. It's for the general direction that they're trying to go, which is going to include whatever they can get away with along the way in the response.
Yeah, I do think it's almost like this. It's when the collective consciousness. I actually just had the QAnon shaman. We kind of got on this topic. I don't know.
It was a great show. I just watched it. Yeah.
Oh, and we were talking about it's kind of like when the collective consciousness reaches a certain level. That's when they hit it with that, and that drives you back into fear. It drives you into these trauma cycles that just kind of naturally infect the collective psyche and the individual psyches for many people. And how does that who benefits from this? Because it sure isn't us,
Maybe podcasters, we have something to talk about. But
yeah, it gives me a lot of content.
Yeah, well, Jose, I really do appreciate you coming on. And like I said a couple times now, we've really tickled the surface that you scratch. We're not even scratching yet. So there's so much more to dive into. So highly recommend, of course, checking out No Way Jose and going on deep dives over there. And then, take these rabbit holes wherever they might lead you, if you so dare. Before I let you go, feel free to plug away on anything else you got going on. Of course, like you mentioned, we got Tinfoil Hat coming up. I'm sure by the time this releases, it'll be either out or almost out or something like that.
Yeah, like you said, the Tinfoil Hat, so definitely check that out. I have the No Way Jose Show. If I'm on YouTube, all major odd podcasters Odyssey as well. Follow me on Twitter at TowerGangJose. The only real big thing I have coming soon is I'm bringing the QAnon Shaman. I just had the QAnon Shaman on, so you can go check that out. But I'm also bringing him back on, and I'm doing one of my 4 Pony Boys series episodes with him and Shane Cashman. So that'll be a fun one. If you've listened to the QAnon Shaman talk before and you know who Shane Cashman is, it'll be fun. We'll get into weird, probably conspiracies for sure, because that's I think where we'll end up being.
This is like playing with action figures for you. It's like playing with podcast action figures, just tossing them together and see what happens.
It's literally, as I was listening to him, I'm just like, you know what? I bet you'd vibe with Shane. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to make it happen.
All right, well, I really look forward to that one. Jose, thanks so much for coming on my show. I'll see you over Smoke-Filled Room. All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jose Gallison, a fellow Florida man. Always happy to support a fellow podcaster and a fellow Florida man. And Jose's been killing it, going out and talking about Oklahoma City. He says he's not an expert, but in my point of view, just like me, I'm probably not an expert in any specific area of libertarianism for those of you that followed me from the Lions Liberty days. But because I spent 9 years talking to every other expert in libertarianism, I had a pretty good overview of the entire situation and could speak pretty damn confidently on it. So I look at Jose as kind of like the Marc Clair of the Oklahoma City bombing, because he's interviewed so many different experts, spent, like he said, over 15 hours doing content on this specific topic. So I think he was the perfect person to come on and break it down with you. Be sure to check out his show, No Way Jose, as well as the Tower Gang. Always have a blast with those guys. That being said, we got a good one for you next week. I'm not even gonna spoil it. I'm just gonna tell you it's gonna be a good one. And until then, in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.